Okay, hi everyone. I'm Aisha Mian. I'm from Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I'm the president. And today we're doing the first in our series of interviews with various experts, professional, academics, anyone that does anything around drugs or drug policy reform. So first I'm going to introduce you to the rest of my team. I have Katie Anderson, who is our support and outreach officer. Say hi, Katie.
Hey.
And we have Judy Chang, who is our international officer. Say hey, Judy.
Hi.
And today we are joined by the fabulous Johann Hari, author of new book come out recently, Chasing the Scream. It's already doing really well. I think number 21 on Amazon's bestseller list. So hey, Johann, how you doing?
Hi Aisha, hey everyone, love to see you.
Yeah, so let's just get straight into this. So Johann, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Yeah, should I talk a little bit about the book? I mean, it's now 100 years since drugs were first banned, and as the centenary was coming up, I realised that there were loads of really basic questions that I didn't feel I knew the answer to. You know, why were drugs banned 100 years ago? You know, why do we continue with the war on drugs even though a lot of people can see it's failed? What really causes drug use and drug addiction, and what are the alternatives? So basically I set off, I describe this in the book, on a kind of epic journey really. I ended up crossing 30,000 miles, going to 8 different countries to really try to figure out what was really going on, and I wanted to understand it really from the ground up. You know, I wanted to understand what it's like for ordinary people. I didn't want to do a big kind of grand abstract argument book about the war on drugs. I wanted to know what it's really like. So I tell the story from like a whole range of people, from Billie Holiday, who I talk about, who was stalked and killed by the founder of the war on drugs, Harry Anslinger, to loads of people I met, whether it was like a transsexual crack dealer in Brooklyn, or a hitman for one of the deadliest Mexican cartels, to the doctor who led Portugal to decriminalize all drugs. So that's the kind of gist of it, really.
Yeah, so that's awesome. So what sort of, like, I know you said a little bit about like doing the book. So how has it been when you've actually been doing the book? I mean, like actually going through that journey. Have you felt that you've changed? Like, what do you think you've learned from it?
Oh, I learned so many things. I mean, partly it's just what life is like. One of the things that I really love was being able to go back, over some of them. For example, Chino Hardin, the transsexual crack dealer in Brooklyn, going back over 3 years and really getting to know Chino and really getting to understand the dynamics of what the drug war does to people who are at the heart of it. And Chino was conceived when his mother, who was a crack addict, was raped by his father, who was an NYPD officer. Chino is like a child of the drug war in the purest sense. Chino became a crack dealer when he was 13, was in and out of Rikers the whole time. His story to me tells you so much about the war on drugs. But I discovered loads of things. Addiction is not what I thought it is. Actually, the thing that blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs aren't what we think they are. Addiction isn't what we think it is. The drug war isn't what we think it is. And the alternatives aren't what we've been told they are for so long. So I think it's incredibly exciting and a bit daunting to kind of realize, oh, fuck, so much of what we think we know is not right. And there's this totally other story out there that that we need to hear about.
So yeah, do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you mean? Like, what are some of like the biggest things that you found to be like the biggest misconceptions?
The one that shocked me, one that I just didn't know at all going in, was that what we believe about addiction is not right, and what we've been told about. If you'd said to me 4 years ago, what causes drug addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a bit thick, and I would have said, well, drugs cause drug addiction, right? We had addiction in my family. It seems to me obvious. We've been told this story for 100 years, and it's become almost like our common sense. So what we think is, if us 4 and the next 20 people we meet randomly, if we all used heroin for 20 days, on day 21, our body would physically need the heroin. The chemical hooks in the drug would have made us physically dependent, and we would need the drug and we would crave it, and that is what addiction is, right? We think that's what addiction means. And the first thing that really pricked my sense that wasn't right is what I learned from Gabor Mate, who's an amazing doctor and writer in Vancouver who treats addicts, who kind of pointed out that if any of us get run over after doing this interview, obviously I hope we don't, and we break our hip, you know, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's really good heroin. It's much better heroin than you buy on the street because it's medically pure. You can be given it for quite a long period of time. In every hospital in Britain, there are loads of people who are being given heroin, right? If what we believed about addiction was right, a significant number of those people should leave the hospital and try to score on the streets. If the drug is what hooks you, they should leave as addicts. That never happens, virtually never happens. And that made me think, oh, there must be something else going on here. And that's when I went and met Bruce Alexander, who's an amazing guy. He's a professor in Vancouver. And he explained to me the old theory about addiction that we have comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You guys at SSDP could do them if you were feeling a bit sadistic. Really easy. You get a rat and you put it in a cage. And in the cage, it's got two water bottles. One is just tap water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and very rapidly kill itself. And they go, well, there you go. That's addiction. That's how it works. And Bruce came along in the 70s and said, well, hang on a minute. We're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except take the drugs. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park, which is like heaven for rats, right? The rats have got loads of lovely food, loads of friends to have sex with, loads of coloured balls, everything a rat about town could possibly want. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the crazy thing. In Rat Park, the rats don't like the drugged water. They don't drink very much of it. None of them use it obsessively, and none of them overdose. So you go from all the rats in isolation overdosing to none of the rats in a nice environment. And Bruce says this tells us that both the right-wing theory of addiction and the left-wing theory of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory of addiction is it's a moral failing. You party too hard, you know, you indulge yourself, you get addicted, there you are. The left-wing theory of addiction is that, oh, it's a disease, it's inborn, it's something wrong with your brain. What Bruce says, it's not your morality, it's not your brain, it's your cage. Addiction is an adaptation to your environment. And there's loads of human examples of that I can talk about, but I think it'll actually fit with a lot of people, with what a lot of people know from their own experience. That's the thing that most blew me away, to realise that, and it has massive implications for the war on drugs. If what causes addiction is the drug, then it might make sense to try to physically eradicate the drug. Obviously, I don't think that's physically possible anyway. Like, we can't stop drugs getting into prisons, and we control the walled perimeter, so good luck keeping them out of Britain or America. But, you know, okay, in theory, you can see the argument. But if, in fact, what causes the addiction isn't the drug, if, in fact, loads of people can use the drug, in fact, the vast majority of people can use the drug and not have this problem, then that tells you that we've got to deal with the other problems, the isolation and the being cut off. And what's fascinating about Portugal is that's what they've built a system designed to do, and the results are amazing, and we can talk about that later if you want.
So yeah, just before we get on to Portugal, I know Katie and Judy, they had a bit more specific questions around that. Katie, did you want to ask what you had to say about that?
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, Johann. I think that that image of addiction that you described in the book was completely contrary to what I had in my head before I read it, and it blew my mind as well, pretty much. And I was wondering as well, like when you've spoken to people, sort of interviewing the book, and in your own personal experience, have you found that to be true? Have you found that it's people who become addicted who have sort of negative social circumstances, who have like traumatic past experiences?
I think it's really interesting that. And thank you for what you said. I think it's really interesting that I wouldn't say negative social circumstances, I would say people who are radically disconnected. Because if you think about, for example, rock stars, right? In fact, you think about Elton John, who you know, has written lovely things about the book. You know, Elton became a drug addict. He was cut off at the top of society, not at the bottom. If you're a really famous rock star, you can't walk the streets. You can't have, you know, it's very hard to have normal relationships. You're as cut off in a funny sort of way as those isolated rats in the first. You're closer to the isolated rats in the rat cages than you are to the rats in Rat Park. And I think it's really interesting that one thing that's important to understand is obviously poverty makes it more likely you'll be disconnected and cut off. But I don't think it's not just poverty. There are lots of circumstances in which you can be quite well off and massively disconnected and unable to bond with people. The other thing you bring up is really interesting about childhood trauma, and that's another thing I learned from Gabor Mate. You know, Gabor was, when he was working with he worked on the downtown east side of Vancouver, which has the highest concentration of addicts in North America. And he noticed all of the hardcore addicts he was working with had horrendous childhoods. And he then went and did lots of research into this. And what he found, there's this really interesting thing called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or maybe survey, that found that there's an incredibly strong correlation between childhood trauma and adult addiction. For every traumatic event that happens to a child, they're 2 to 4 times, seriously traumatic event, they're 2 to 4 times more likely to become an addict as an adult. And that's totally related to what Bruce discovered, because you think about it, if you have a really traumatic childhood, you find it difficult to trust people, you find it difficult to build normal bonds with people, you don't trust that the world will be orderly and stable and look after you, and so you're much more likely to be isolated. So that's like a kind of sub-branch of disconnection, that childhood trauma makes it harder for people to bond. Now, of course, some people are able to overcome that. But, so I think you're totally right, and I think that really fit with, it fits with my experience, it fits with the experience of my family, it fits with the experience, if I think about, I went in Arizona to this horrific prison called Tent City. Estrella Prison is the official name, where women, men and women, but I spent most of the time with the women, are forced to go out on chain gangs, wearing T-shirts saying, "I was a drug addict, this is what you get." The exact words are in the book. They're forced to go out on a chain gang and dig graves and be publicly humiliated. And spending time with these women, I really got a sense of how crazy this is. These are traumatized and broken women, right? I spoke to them for hours and they talk about how awful their lives have been. The idea that traumatizing them even more, literally putting them in solitary confinement. I went to the hole, which is what they call it, which is like the shoe in Orange is the New Black, where women are just put in this hole for it's just a concrete hole for up to a month for ridiculously minor infractions like having a cigarette. And the idea that, it was so ironic, it was like they had actually recreated in human form the original cages from the, before the Rat Park experiment. It was madness. So yeah, it totally fit what I saw, and I really got a sense of how the war on drugs deepens. In fact, Gabor said to me, if we wanted to create a situation, the exact words are in the book, but words to the effect where he said, if you wanted to create a system that would make addiction worse, this is what you would create.
Yeah. So when you were in Vancouver, did you manage to get to check out the Insight facility?
Yeah, it was amazing. One of the most inspiring stories I got for the book, actually, and one that has really helped me to be optimistic, is the story of how Insight came to happen. So for people who don't know, Insight is the safe injecting room where drug addicts can go and use safely, and they're monitored. And it's really weird, actually. Insight, it looks like a hairdresser's. You go in and there's these like nicely lit booths, and it looks like a branch of Tony and Guy, basically. But the story of how Insight came to happen, I think, is something. I know a lot of people who get involved in this work. It's tempting to be depressed. It's tempting to get down. In the year 2000, a guy called Bud Osborne, who was a homeless street addict on the streets of the downtown east side, was watching his friends die all around him. A lot of them would shoot up behind dumpsters because they didn't want the police to see them. But obviously, if you shoot up where the police can't see you, if you start to OD, no one can see you. So the body would be found like a day later. And Bud resolved that he had to do something. And he couldn't just let this carry on. But he was like, I'm a homeless street addict. What can I do? And he started by doing a really simple thing. He got together a load of the addicts. And he said, why don't we just patrol the alleyways ourselves to spot people who are ODing? We'll have a timetable. And if we spot someone who's ODing, we'll just call an ambulance. And so he did that. The addicts did that for themselves. And within 6 months, the overdose rate had really significantly fallen, which was great in itself. But also the addicts started thinking, maybe we're not the pieces of shit that we're always told we are. Wow, we can actually do something positive. They started to go to the public meetings that were organised about like the menace of the addicts. And they would sit at the back very politely, and about halfway through they'd kind of put up their hand and go, oh, I think you're talking about us. Could we do anything differently? And sometimes people would be angry, and sometimes they'd say, well, you leave your needles lying around. And Bud said, that's fine. We'll extend the patrols. We'll go and collect the needles. And a little while after that, Bud and his friends learned about how in Vancouver they had safe injecting rooms. And and it had massively saved lives. And they basically started to stalk the mayor of Vancouver, Philip Owen, everywhere he went with a coffin. And the coffin said, "Who will die next before you open a safe injecting room, Philip Owen," right? Or I can't remember the exact words, but something like that. And Philip Owen was like a right-wing businessman. Like, he reminded me of Mitt Romney, right? A kind of right-wing businessman from a rich family, had no idea about any of this stuff. And for 2 years, he just spouts drug war rhetoric. And massively to Philip Owen's credit, after 2 years of being stalked, he just one day says, "Who the fuck are these people?" And he goes incognito to the downtown east side, and he meets loads of addicts. And he had no idea. And he then goes to meet Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who was really good on the drug war. And Philip Owen comes back and he holds a press conference and he says, and it's the coroner, it's the chief of police, and a load of addicts. And Philip Owen says, "We're going to open the first safe injecting room in North America. We're going to have the most compassionate drug policy in North America." And they open it. And Philip Owen is deselected by his own party. It's a right-wing party. And they get another right-wing candidate, and the left candidate wins and keeps the injecting room open. But what's so amazing is it's now 10 years on, a bit more than 10 years now, and the results are in. Average life expectancy on the downtown east side has improved by 10 years, according to the coroner's office, and overdose is down by 80%, 80%. That's mind-blowing. You don't get figures, improvement in mortality like that, except at the end of a war, which is, of course, what this is. And Bud, who I got to know well and loved, and people can listen to the interviews with him on the website, chasingthescream.com, Bud died last year. He was only in his early 60s. And, you know, life as a street addict had, before the end of the war in Vancouver, had really taken a toll on him. And when Bud died, they sealed off the streets of the downtown east side where he had lived as a homeless person and had this incredible memorial service. And there were loads of people in that crowd who knew they were alive because of what he started. And what I would say to anyone who gets a bit depressed in this field, and it can be depressing, is you have so much more power than you know. You know, Bud was a homeless street addict, and he started an uprising that transformed Vancouver and saved a huge number of lives. If they can do it, if a group of homeless street addicts can do it, us with a lot more privilege, there's a huge amount we can achieve to stop this war. And Insight is really his monument, and the Canadian Supreme Court has now ruled that can never be shut down. Drug users have an inalienable human right to a safe place to use their drugs. And if he hadn't started that, that would never have happened. So think about what we can start.
Yeah, exactly. That's like a really important point to make. I mean, like, I know a lot of people can feel really down and out about, you know, the obstacles, a lot of the challenges. There's a lot of stigma, a lot of discrimination. A lot of people are still afraid to come out and speak out even about, you know, drug use. So yeah, I mean, like, people can think all the odds are against them, but, you know, we can do it. And that's really important to know that we can do it. We just have to sort of get together. We have to, you know, put in that effort, and it can happen. And especially with so much that's going on around the world now, we have no excuse not to. Everything is fitting in our favor to make these changes, because in the end, you know, it's about protecting human rights. It's about, you know, saving lives. It's not about everyone going out and having the freedom to, you know, just go get high and do whatever they want and just die left, right, and center. It's just not about that. So yeah, you know, like, I really love the idea of Insight. I know they had a lot of trouble, like, setting up, but it was mostly political, you know, and it always seems to come down to that. And I know we've sort of, like, touched a bit on, like, sort of the addiction side of it, but I wanted to kind of bring it over to, you know, the recreational users. And what are your thoughts? Because I know a lot of people do talk about the addiction side, and a lot of people do say, and, you know, this is what's happened with the addicts, and look at them coming forward. But majority of users are actually, you know, recreational. They're non-problematic users, and I think it's important that the majority of recreational users, they can come out against this. And what do you think about this? What do you think are the obstacles for the non-addicts to come out and, you know, stand up against the war on drugs?
I think what you're saying is really important, and again, this is a fact that surprised me, because, I mean, it wasn't my family's experience. If I said to you, picture an alcohol user, you'll probably picture someone sitting in a pub having a nice beer. if I said to you, picture a cocaine user, you will probably picture someone a bit out of control. Actually, the cocaine user is no more likely and possibly less likely to be out of control than the alcohol user. One of the stats that really struck me, I was introduced to by Danny and Steve from Transform, Danny Kushlik and Steve Rolls, is that even the UN Office of Drug Control, which is the main drug war body in the world, they are no liberalisers, admits that 90% of all currently legal drug use is non-problematic. It doesn't cause any health problems, doesn't cause any addiction. 90%, this isn't a small minority, that's the overwhelming majority of drug use is non-problematic. And it was really striking actually interviewing Carl Hart, the professor of neuroscience at Columbia, that him explaining this is true even of the most hardcore drugs. Even the most hardcore drugs, most people who use them are not harmed by them, which took me a really long time and a lot of times of going back to interview Carl and looking at the evidence to really get my head around. And I think you're totally right that part of the effect of the war on drugs is it drives the unharmed majority underground. The reason we know, almost all of us know, that alcoholism is a tragedy and it is rare among alcohol users is because we know loads of alcohol users and we see them all around us all the time. We don't see the other forms of drug use because it would be extremely unwise to do them in public because you would be arrested. And we don't have shared social spaces where we do them that much. So part of the problem is by driving the majority of normal drug users underground where we don't see them and they don't talk about it publicly because they don't want their employers Googling them and seeing it, the drug war actually creates a kind of self-reinforcing dynamic where it creates a completely false picture of what drug use is that then keeps the drug war going. So I think you're right, and I'm really conflicted about what we do about that. So there are people who argue you should have kind of coming out movements where people talk about normal drug use, and that was definitely a factor in how they managed to win the majorities for legalization in marijuana in Colorado and Washington State. From interviewing the people who were involved in those campaigns, all the key figures, they all agreed that part of it was, although there was differences between them, they all agreed that part of it was just people aren't as scared of marijuana anymore because they just know people who do it. It's a bit like one of the ways that attitudes towards gay people changed. It's just once you knew, oh yeah, I've got my cousin who's gay and he's not whatever crazy thing people thought about gay people, or he's just a nice person. So I think coming out as drug users is important for people who are drug users, but I also think it's really important that a key plank of all of this is to say you can be in favour of legalisation and not want to ever use any drugs. I don't like alcohol. I drink wine like once a year, twice a year. I really don't like it. No one would think it's weird that I don't like alcohol and I'm against alcohol prohibition. That would be, no one would regard that as a contradiction. And Tonya Winchester, a super smart person who was one of the leading figures in the Washington State marijuana legalization campaign, one of the first things she would say to people when she was trying to persuade them, I quote this in the book, she would always say, I'm not asking you to like marijuana. I'm not asking you if you use marijuana. I'm not asking you if you want to use marijuana. I'm asking you if you think this is a good use of your money. I'm asking you if you think we should ruin young people's lives and give them a criminal record for doing this. I'm not asking you whether you think it's good or bad. And I think that's really important. So I'm a bit, as you can kind of tell from the slightly waffly nature of my answer, I'm a bit conflicted about this. I do think people should have the liberty to use drugs. I do think people should be free to talk about it openly. I don't think that should define our movement. A movement of drug users will always be a minority movement. A movement of people who think it's a waste of money, it's cruel and senseless to wage the drug war, that's going to be a bigger majority.
So yeah, there's loads of points that I could have picked up on from there. But first I'm going to let Judy and Katie, did you guys have anything to ask or say?
Well, I just wanted to maybe bring it back to drug user activism and also your point about, needing a more broader-based movement. In what ways do you think there are good examples where drug user activists or drug user organizations have been able to, say, link up with, policymakers or more mainstream society to, create, I guess, change, positive change?
I think you guys probably know the answer to that better than I do. I think Van Du, the group that Bud was involved in forming in Vancouver, is the best example I've ever come across. Sensible Colorado, which was the Safer Colorado, which was the group that was founded by Mason Tvert and some other people in Colorado. They were a really smart group. I think you guys would know better than me, to be honest. I think, yeah.
So, I mean, like, the key difference in what's going on in America between them and the UK is that well, it's pretty obvious. We have, like, very different socio-political, economic contexts, and all of the very, these major indifferences, all this cruel punishment, all of the strong motivating factors which really got people to say this is just completely unacceptable, this is so unfair, this is a waste of everyone's money, time, we're unnecessarily, criminalizing a whole swathe of our population, we're disproportionately arresting and criminalizing a lot of youth, a lot of minorities. It was very obvious, all the reasons. You couldn't help but say this is just ridiculous. But I feel in the UK it's a bit more subtle. We don't have such extreme examples to get the mass public to rally behind it. I feel like these are sort of the differences. Go on. You want to say?
I think you're right, except in one respect. So obviously we don't have the most kind of grisly and barbaric. We're not sending women out on chain gangs in the streets of Birmingham or whatever. But what I would say is one especially disastrous aspect of the war on drugs is really at work in Britain. And that's so, as you guys know really well, when you criminalise a popular substance, it doesn't go away. You just transfer it from off licenses and doctors to armed criminal gangs. And those armed criminal gangs, if we go into a branch of Oddbins and we try to steal a load of beer, they'll ring the police and the police will take us away, right? So Oddbins don't have to be frightening, they don't have to be violent, they just ring the police. If we go up to a weed dealer or a smack dealer and we try to steal their goods, they obviously can't ring the police because the police will come and arrest them. So they have to fight back. More than that, they have to, ideally, they're going to establish a reputation for being such terrifying bastards that no one would ever dream of going and robbing them. So the sociologist Philippe Bourgeois calls it, the war on drugs creates a kind of culture of terror where you have to have drug dealers who are terrifying. Chino taught that to me incredibly well in Brooklyn. And actually there's a really good phrase, Charles Bowden, who died last year, the writer, he said, the war on drugs creates a war for drugs between gangs, and that is totally playing out in Britain. I'm sure a load of these stabbings that are happening in London are rival drug gangs. I mean, there have been some reports of that. I haven't looked into that in great detail, but the war for drugs is definitely happening in Britain, and all the problems associated with drugs being controlled by armed criminal gangs. So they sell an absolutely shitty, contaminated product. It's why was it 3 or 4 people died a couple of weeks back, because they believed they were taking ecstasy. In fact, they were taking something completely different. Imagine if every time you bought a beer, you didn't know if it was 1% alcohol or 40% alcohol. Imagine if you didn't know if it had strychnine in it, So definitely the catastrophic, and Anne-Marie Cox, the woman whose daughter died after taking prohibited ecstasy, who's now an amazing campaigner against the drug war, and I actually would be a great person for you guys to interview. She's an extraordinary person. So I think it's true that we don't have the grisly American, you want to put it crudely, we don't have Orange is the New Black, but we do have Breaking Bad. Is how I would put it, if you wanted to put it in the most crude possible way. We don't have The Wire, but we do have Breaking Bad.
So yeah, God, there's a lot to say about the UK and how we can try and make a difference here. But I wanted to
I'll just say one other thing. Sorry, just before I forget. Mike Trace was talking me through the figures the other day. The former.
Yeah.
Love Mike Trace, and he was explaining there are, I believe, more than 1,000 people in prison in Britain for drug possession charges. So we shouldn't forget it's not no one. It's not. Sometimes you get people like Peter Hitchens saying, "Well, I can respect," although I disagree with very strongly on this. as on almost everything, who says, you know, we've effectively decriminalised drugs. Well, there's 1,000 people in prison who are going to be surprised to hear it, and there's something like 30,000 people who go before magistrates' courts every year just for cannabis possession. So it's not no one.
I think that's really important to remember, and especially when, you know, if you're caught with possession of a drug, you can get a caution, 2 cautions, I think, or 3 cautions, and you get a conviction. You know, if you have a caution, that can stop you from doing certain things. It can stop you from like working in law. It can stop you working with kids if it comes up on like an extended CRB check. So there's lots of stuff it can prevent you from doing, just because it's not as, like you're saying, so it's not perhaps as extreme as the States doesn't mean there's not like an issue here as well.
I think you're totally right, and I think the other thing that's really striking is, you know, one of the things that's awful when you look at the American situation is the racial disparities, right, which are mind-blowing. Like, you know, I can't remember, the exact stats are in the book. I think the figure is 17% of drug dealers are African-American, and they make up 65% of the people who go to prison for it, something like that. Mm-hmm. The racial disparity in the US is worse than it was in apartheid South Africa, which gives you some sense of how bad it is. But mind-blowingly, the only country in the developed world with a worse racial disparity in drug arrests is us. You know, it's Britain. That's really shocking. You know, basically, only young black men are arrested for this in Britain. Even though everyone knows young black men are not the only people using drugs in Britain. So it's appalling, and this is partly what happens. Partly that's kind of conscious racism on the part of the police, but actually there's a more subtle thing going on that if you have a law that is broken by like almost half of the population, obviously you can't give half the population criminal records. So who do they go after? They go after the low-hanging fruit. There's a really damning quote in the book from a guy called Matthew Fogg, who he didn't say it directly to me, but he said in a speech, he was a cop in DC, I think, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, you know, one day he went to one of his bosses and he said, hey boss, when we're doing drug raids, why do we only ever go to the black neighborhoods? I suspect white people, why don't we go to a white neighborhood? And his boss said something like, well, you're right, of course white people use drugs in the same way, but if we go to a white neighborhood, those people are going to get lawyers. They know judges and journalists. They're going to make a fuss. Let's just go for the low-hanging fruit. So it's the nature of the drug war that it will always work that way.
Yeah, I found that really, really... Sorry, Aisha, go on.
No, go on.
I said I found that really, really shocking. You had that quote in particular from that guy, and I was like, it just makes total sense. Like, if they had gone out after people, you know, with resources, with connections, and tried to give them, you know, drug convictions, I'm sure the drug laws would have been turned over years ago. Because they haven't been doing that, and they've concentrated it in particular areas, and people don't have the resources to do that. I think that's one of the reasons it's sort of dragged on in this way, which is just, yeah, just ridiculous.
And a good example of that is it has been reported, I haven't looked into this, I don't know any more than what's been reported, that one of David Cameron's relatives developed a drug problem and went to rehab and was treated really well. I have yet to find a politician who supports the drug war who, when they find out one of their own family becomes a drug addict, rings the police and has them carted off. What they do is what we would all wish for everyone. They get them compassionate care. And what we should have is a drug policy that gives to everyone what we would want for the people we love.
So yeah, bringing in from the care side, I want you to talk a little bit about when you must have met Dr. João from Portugal and the sort of Portuguese experience. Do you want to tell us a bit about what happened there and what
I'm glad that you said his name wrong as well. It was really embarrassing.
I'm not
Whenever I went, they would say, I'd say, what's the correct way to say your name? And he'd go, João Goulão. And I go, oh, João Goulão. And he'd go, no, João Goulão. And I kept saying, there's something about I simply cannot make any of the sounds that Portuguese should sound like in any way. Which is a great tragedy to me. Brazilians are the hottest people in the world. I will never be able to impress them in their own language. The Portugal really blew my mind. If I'm completely honest, I put off going to Portugal for a while because I was really worried that I thought, what if I go to Portugal and that hasn't worked either? This will be the most depressing book ever written, right? Actually, fortunately, what's happened in Portugal is incredible. And the best way to explain it is in the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst problems in drug problems in Western Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And they had been trying the American way of cracking down, and every year they cracked down, it just got worse and worse. And so what happened is and this is an interesting model for us in all sorts of ways, the leader of the opposition and the prime minister got together and they said, okay, look, let's set up a panel of scientists and judges and social scientists, and let's get them to figure out what we should do, and let's agree in advance that whatever they recommend, we'll do. So it just took it out of politics. And they go away, and João Goulão, whose name I'm definitely saying wrong, came back, who led it, and he's just such an amazing man. We should get a campaign going to get him the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, which we can talk about later. But so João comes back. João had set up the first ever rehab centre in Portugal, and he comes back, and he says, the panel comes back and says, let's decriminalise everything from cannabis to crack, and let's use all the money that we currently use on arresting drug users, trying drug users, imprisoning drug users. Let's use all that money instead on really good care for addicts, which is partly psychological support and rehab, but actually the most interesting bit, it fits much more back with what you guys were saying with Rat Park, much more about reconnecting addicts to society. So a good example is subsidised jobs. Say you're a smack addict who used to be a mechanic and your life fell apart. What they do is they go to a garage and they say, if you employ this guy as a mechanic, we'll pay half his wages for a year. The goal is to make sure that every addict has a meaning and purpose in life, that they have something to get out of bed for. Why are none of us? We could be drunk all the time. Forget the drug laws. We could just be. All four of us could be drinking vodka now, right? We could drink vodka tomorrow. We could drink vodka every day. Why are we not doing it? Mostly it's because we've got stuff to do, because we've got people we want to be present with in the world, and we've got work we want to do, and we've got meaning in our lives. That's what the whole Portuguese system is designed to do. It's the opposite of the drug war dynamic. It's the opposite of what happens in Arizona, where you cut people off, you make it harder for them to get jobs, you make it harder for them to get lives. The whole Portuguese system is about making it as easy as possible for people to get back into a life, a meaningful life. And it's been 14 years, nearly 15 years, and the results are in. We've got to be candid. Drug use has slightly gone up by about 5 to 6%. It might be that people are more honest when they're asked, but I suspect there probably is a slight increase. Drug addiction, by every measure, is down. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down. HIV transmission is massively down. Teenage drug use remains the same, so the most problematic form of drug use didn't increase. And one of the ways you know it's a success is virtually no one in Portugal wants to go back. One of the most moving interviews I had was with a guy who, I'm also going to mispronounce this, João Figueira, who is the chief drug cop in Portugal, and he was the leader of the opposition to the decriminalisation. And he said the kind of things that, like, you would expect the Daily Mail to say in Britain. This will be a disaster, we'll have drug use everywhere. And when I interviewed him, I'm paraphrasing the exact quotes are in the book, but he basically said, everything I said would happen didn't happen. Everything the other side said would happen did come to pass. And he talked about how he regretted that he'd spent all those years arresting and harassing drug users, and he hopes the whole world follows our example. And one of the things that really encouraged me about, lots of things encouraged me about it, but when speaking to him, I kind of thought, actually, this is one of those debates. It's not like arguing with, I don't know, homophobes, where basically we just have an irreconcilable difference, right? We think gay people should be free, they don't, right? With prohibitionists, actually, not all of them, obviously some are racist or whatever, but actually a lot of prohibitionism is based on goals that we would share. We don't want kids to use drugs. We don't want people to become addicted. And actually, it's just that we agree on the goals. It's just that our methods are better ways of achieving the goals that we agree with. I actually think I agree with Peter Hitchens on most things about what we want drug policy to do. Not everything, but most things. It's just a debate about how we get there, where obviously we have a really profound disagreement.
I think, like you said, Johann, that experiment has been going in Portugal for like over 15 years now, right? And there's similar things going on in Colorado and like Washington, where they've legalized weed. I mean, marijuana is being like decriminalized in Holland for like God knows how long. Czech Republic, they've also decriminalized drugs for a few years now, I think. Why? I wanted to ask you, like, why do you think that we haven't seen any changes in drug laws whatsoever in the UK yet, despite all these other examples around the world?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's I mean, British drug policy has actually gone backwards. There's a chapter in the book about the extraordinary experiment in Widnes in Merseyside, where they prescribed an amazing doctor called John Marks, massively expanded heroin prescription, and the results were incredible. Burglary fell by 93%. The police were huge champions of it. Marks and Spencer sponsored a conference about it because they were so chuffed that their shoplifting rates fell so much. The addicts on the program didn't have any of the problems that we associate with addiction. They didn't have any of the worst problems. They didn't have abscesses. They didn't have wounds, because those are things caused by prohibition, and contaminated drugs are not things caused by the drug themselves. So it's worse than you say. We've actually gone backwards. But I think it's a combination of things. We have really good drug policy analysis in Britain. Transformer, world leaders. I mean, they're just amazing. What we don't have is a grassroots movement. I know the phrase grassroots is slightly ironic in this context, so forgive me. But we don't have a movement of people demanding change, and ultimately politicians respond to the pressure that's put on them. So if you're a politician, you're making a decision. You weigh the gain of the they're not sitting there dispassionately figuring out what's best for the people of Britain. They're figuring out, what shit do I get if I make this decision versus what praise do I get if I make this decision. And basically, if you have progress on drug policy, you're going to get a hell of a lot of shit and not very much praise, because at the moment we don't have a strong enough grassroots movement that will demand it. And actually, this is one of those things, and this is unusual actually, all of the party leaders have said really good things about this in the past. A man I would never normally praise in 1,000 years, Nigel Farage, used to say fantastic things about, I mean, not just good things, but really good things about drug policy. David Cameron, when he was a backbencher, said really excellent things about drug policy and doesn't deny that he was a drug user and misused. Nick Clegg says very good things about drug policy. Ed Miliband, weirdly, is obviously those four the one that I'm most personally sympathetic to, is the one who said the least good things, but then he just doesn't really say anything about it. It's not that I can't imagine Ed Miliband is privately. I never talked to him about it, but I can't imagine privately he's a kind of drug warrior. But again, they're waiting for the movement that will pressure them. That line Franklin Roosevelt said, I think it might be apocryphal, but apparently said, when he's elected and he's a kind of austerity hawk as president, people forget that now. And there's loads of protests, and it's one of the protest leaders, and the guy basically tells him he's got to do, a much more radical program, and Roosevelt apocryphally says, that's a great idea, now go out there and make me do it. That's the best you can hope for from a politician, that they'll try to encourage the movements that will pressure them. And we've got to have a movement. I think also we've got to address people's totally legitimate fears, There was... people's fears about legalization are totally legitimate. They're not. It's not like fears about gay marriage or something. The things they're concerned about are things people should be concerned about. Now, I think we actually have better solutions for the things they're concerned about, obviously. But I think it's about explaining to people. At the moment, people think legalization means anarchy and a free-for-all. What we have to explain to people is the situation we have now is anarchy and a free-for-all, right? We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown users, right? That legalization, as Danny Kushlik puts it really well, and I quote him on the book in this, I think, legalization is a way of extending regulation to the current marketplace. If you look at how they won the referendum in Switzerland, I'm a Swiss citizen as well as a British citizen because of my dad, and Switzerland is a really right-wing country, like really right-wing. My Swiss relatives, make Nigel Farage look like Tony Benn, and 70% of Swiss people voted for legal heroin for addicts. And it was won with a pretty conservative argument. It was about restoring order. It was saying drug war means anarchy, criminals, disease, filth. Legalization means bring the addicts into nice, clean clinics, make sure they're not diseased, bankrupt the criminals. Those are the kind of arguments that it's interesting looking at the places where they've won the argument. Liberty-based arguments for ending the war on drugs, while I'm sympathetic to them, are not popular. They don't poll well, people don't like them. Order-based arguments for ending the war on drugs work really well, and they're true. So we may as well use the ones that are true and work well.
Yeah, Judy, do you have anything you wanted to comment on as well?
Well, yeah, I do think it's a really good point that there needs to be, for drug policy advocates, it's important to focus on health and public safety, but they usually do things that, mainstream society really thinks is important. Yeah, yeah, like you see in Asia Pacific, they're really, really hard on drugs, but uh, advocates will use the health and the safety approach. Yeah, and I think there needs to be a bigger focus on those kind of studies, I guess.
It's really interesting you mentioned Asia as well. I didn't actually use it in the book because the first draft was so monstrously long that no sane person would want to read it. But I went to Vietnam, and the situation in Vietnam is horrendous. Like, when is it? Like 12 years ago, something like that. Addicts just started to disappear, and I interviewed people who were kind of. It then emerged that they were sent to these forced labour camps where they're forced to work to manufacture these. These are like chronic drug addicts.
Yeah.
Sent to forced labour camps where they're made to work to manufacture things. And I met some of the really kind of traumatised people who've been through those camps, and I will write about that at some point. The Asian drug war is horrendous. The Russian drug war is off the scale terrible. This is really a global one. Actually, some of the worst atrocities are happening in Asia and in Russia, and it's a big debate in Russia about whether they're Asian. Vietnam, and that was just shocking what I saw there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really bad what's going on, and this is a thing that I kind of wanted to bring up a bit because, you see the world really fragmented in its response to the war on drugs. So I know a lot of people, especially in North America, will probably be a lot more optimistic. But also I wanted to ask you about, so you're talking a bit about the arguments that should be used. I mean, like, okay, I know you didn't get to say this in your book, but what would you say would be the arguments to be used in Asia? I don't know if you did manage to go to Africa or, but, those kind of regions of the world.
I don't know enough about the internal politics of those countries to say what I would say people should say domestically. What I would say is, in Mexico, where I did spend time, and where I saw by far the worst, off the scale by far the worst things of anything I saw, a fantastic woman called, one of the bravest people I know, Sandra Rodriguez, who's the crime correspondent for El Diario in Juarez, who's just, her colleagues, other journalists just murdered all around her, and she just carries on. Sandra said, I said to her, I'm paraphrasing, I think the quote is in the book, but I said to her, what could be done in Mexico, what arguments should be made in Mexico? And she said, there's no point even having the argument in Mexico. This is imposed on us by the Americans. We don't have any say in our drug policy. This is not, this is not a decision made in Mexico. And then when I went back and looked at the history of it, right back in the 1930s, Mexico had a really sensible drug policy, and the Americans just shut it down. And whenever they tried to move back to a sensible drug policy, they just economically give them a punishment beating. So, this is a policy very much imposed on the world, partly by the predominantly in Latin America by the Americans, which is why it was so inspiring to speak to President Mujica of Uruguay, who's such an incredible man, to just saying, fuck you, we're not going to do it anymore, we're going to legalize, so I think, I don't know enough about Vietnam, but I do know that any country that tries to experiment beyond, most draconian policies gets really threatened. Actually, Ruth Dreyfus, the president of Switzerland who led the legalization of heroin, who is such a great, you should talk to her, she's just, I love Ruth Dreyfus. She said, when she did it, the US drug czar rang her up and was trying to intimidate her, and she was just like, it's not her exact words, but we're a democracy, how dare you? You don't get to come and tell us what to do, And of course Switzerland's in a position where they're a wealthy country and they can do that. If you're the president of Mexico and you're dependent on the American government for trade deals and things, it would be a brave Mexican president who did that. But we need a lot more of that.
In fact, I wanted to ask you about that. So you're talking about, so you've spoken about legalization and decriminalization. I mean, which sort of avenue do you think is the better avenue to go down after, speaking to the people that you've spoken to and writing the book?
Well, so I think it's worth explaining to people the difference. And weirdly, there isn't actually agreement on this. I remember even Mason Tvert, who's one of the big experts on this, who led the Colorado campaign. We were talking at cross purposes quite a lot because I realised we didn't actually even agree on what these words meant. Generally, the way I mean it is decriminalisation is where you stop punishing users. Legalisation is where you provide them with a legal route to get access to the drug. So I'm in favour of legalisation, but it's important to explain to people that legalisation means different things for different drugs. No one wants there to be a crack aisle in Boots, like proposing. So, and as Danny puts it, Danny Kushlik from Transform, the mechanisms of regulation for drugs already exist in our society. And what we should be doing is expanding those mechanisms of regulation to cover other drugs. So with alcohol, obviously we have a situation of regulation where you severely punish people who sell to children. I would actually increase those punishments personally. It's regulated, there's set hours, all of that kind of thing. I would expand that to cover cannabis. The system of regulation that we have for pubs, I would extend to cover ecstasy. So I would have licensed places where you could go and buy ecstasy and other party drugs. I would stress that these should all be cautious experiments. We've tried one way for 100 years, we should cautiously try other ways. For things like heroin, I went to the heroin prescribing clinics in Switzerland, saw how incredibly well they work. Most of the people there have jobs, they have lives, They're certainly a lot better off than heroin addicts in London, and a hell of a lot better off than heroin addicts in Arizona. There's a debate about what you do about things like meth and crack, and it's complicated. Some people would say you would leave them prohibited. Some people would say you'd have almost like an amped up version of Insight, the safe injector is in Vancouver, where you could go, you could get the drug there, but you wouldn't be allowed to leave while you were under the influence of it. I think we need to experiment with alternatives. The one thing we know is the experiment that we tried for 100 years didn't work out so well, so we need to cautiously experiment with the alternatives. But what we do know is, one of the major experiments, and this is the end of alcohol prohibition, what we do know is there are all sorts of things we know happen when you legalise. One is you massively bankrupt organised crime. Where are the violent alcohol dealers in Chicago today? Where are they in London? They don't exist because it's a legal trade. If you banned milk, there would be a violent trade to control milk. It's nothing inherent to drugs. It's the dynamics of a prohibited market. And we know that. There's another really interesting thing we know about what happens when you legalise, which should be much better known, actually. A thing called the Iron Law of Prohibition. The best way to explain it is, the day before alcohol was banned in America, the most popular drink by far was beer. The day after alcohol was banned, the most popular drink was beer. But during Prohibition, beer virtually disappeared. The most popular drinks were whiskey and moonshine, right? And you think, well, why would that be? Why would banning a drug change what people consumed? It's really simple. If you imagine that us four were alcohol smugglers, and we've got a wagon, and we've got to transport some alcohol from across the Canadian border down to whatever, Arkansas. If our wagon is full of beer, we can only get 100 people their drink. If our wagon is full of whiskey, we can get whatever, 1,000 people their drink. But what it means, the Iron Law of Prohibition means, is when you ban something, only the most extreme form of the drug becomes available. So you see this with all prohibited drugs. The most popular way of consuming opiates before they were banned was in syrups. You would buy something called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, right? That disappears, heroin comes in. The most popular way of consuming coca-based products was coca tea. You ban it, who even knows now that you could drink cocaine in tea form? It's gone. You get powder cocaine. When you crack down even harder in the 80s, you get crack. So you get this kind of crazy dynamic where, sometimes you get people saying, as an argument against legalizing marijuana, this isn't the cannabis they had in the 60s. This is super skunk. This is a much more potent thing. They're right. Why is it super skunk? It's because of the Iron Law of Prohibition. That's the result of criminalizing it. Most people, go into any pub tonight, it's a bit late, go tomorrow night, any pub, most people are not ordering vodka, and no one is ordering absinthe, right? The same dynamic would be true of marijuana. Most people don't want super skunk. Most people, just like most people don't want to be hammered with absinthe. but they can't get the more moderate form of the drug. So one thing that will happen when legalization occurs is much more moderate strains of the drug will become more prevalent and more popular.
Yeah, so that's what we say with legalization. We say it's regulation. Legalization means more regulation.
Exactly.
Not the free for all. So yeah, I wanted to sort of get a few of your last thoughts and a couple more things. So, what are your thoughts about Okay, so there's a lot of voter apathy, especially amongst young people here in the UK, and we have the general election coming up. So what would you say, young people should be thinking about, and what do you think young people should do in terms of being able to go out and support, finishing this war on drugs?
I don't think young people should do anything that anyone else shouldn't do. Like I remember, I started being a newspaper columnist when I was 23, and they were always trying to get me, not always, but sometimes they were trying to get me to write like what young people should do, and I'd be like, well, I don't think a 25-year-old should do anything different to a 50-year-old. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I think this is not a young versus old thing, or
well, I'm saying that because we're SSDP UK. So
yeah, totally. I kind of agree with Noam Chomsky. I agree with Chomsky on loads of things, but I think one thing he says in this respect is really important. Actually, it's important to vote. It's valuable, but most politics, it's wrong to think that your job as a political actor, as a citizen, is to turn up and vote once every 5 years. Most of the political agenda is set in between those 5 years. It matters. It matters a lot. The difference between a Labour government and a Conservative government really matters. I see that in even something as small as the educational maintenance allowance, right? That under Labour there was 40 quid a week that went to poor kids to stay on at sixth form. My nephew lives in a pretty poor and rundown part of north of England in Leyland, and there are kids that were friends of his that should have gone on to sixth form and probably would have if they got the educational maintenance allowance, and the Conservatives got rid of it. If the only difference between Labour and the Conservatives at the last election had been that, it would have been worth 5 minutes of your time to go and vote. So it's where I don't agree with my friend Russell Brand about that, and we've had long conversations in which I've entirely failed to persuade him. But so I would, it is worth voting, but what I would say is in terms of the drug war, there's not that much difference between the parties. The Greens are very good. But what will really get them to change is not the voting at the election. This has such low salience in the election voting that you're not going to be able to send much of a signal on the drug war at the general election. But what you can do is, vote because it's worth doing, but then organise to demand it. My battery's about to die. I need to plug in my laptop. I'm sorry. I'm going to give 1 second.
Go for it.
Sorry. There we go. Hang on. Sorry, I suddenly realised it was flashing up with that intimidating red light. There you go. It's plugged in. Yeah.
I wanted to just ask you sort of, for me, one final question. I wanted to say, so what do you think is the future of drug policy reform?
I think it's
in the UK and beyond.
I think it's whatever we make of it. One of the things I learned on this really long journey is we're really powerful. Chino was a isolated crack dealer, and he gave up crack dealing and started a campaign and shut down the youth prison that he was put in when he was 13 years old. That youth prison, that horrendous youth prison, no longer exists because Chino started that campaign. Bud was a homeless street addict, and he transformed his country. Billie Holiday was stalked and hounded by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and she never stopped singing the anti-lynching song that they tried to make her stop singing. And all over the world, while we have this conversation, people are listening to Billie Holiday songs, and they are feeling stronger, and they are happier in their lives. We can achieve so much. I was really left with a kind of ferocious sense of optimism. And particularly in this, there's things that I really care about where I think we've got a massive uphill challenge, like global warming, right? Which is unfortunate because we need a planet. But this is not like that. This is low-hanging fruit politically. Already, most people know this policy has failed. They're hungry for alternatives. I really see that in the reaction to the arguments that I'm putting out there. It's really striking, doing phone-ins or the way people are reacting to the book. It's really striking to me that people are hungry for alternatives on this issue. They know that we've failed for a century, and I think we're going to win this thing. I think we will. You guys are a little bit younger than me, but I think all of us, we're going to live to see the end of this mad policy, and it will be remembered the way alcohol prohibition is remembered. Alcohol prohibition was a massive movement to launch alcohol prohibition. There's a really good history of it by Daniel Ockram. As soon as it ends, whoever argues for going, have you ever heard anyone argue for alcohol prohibition? It's just, it would be regarded as mad if you said it. I think this will go down quite quickly. I guess the thing I would finish with is, this might be a little bit sentimental, but I only ever saw my dad cry once. My mum and dad lived in Berlin for a long time before I was born. My brother was born there. And one day when I was, 10, I came home and my mum and dad were watching the TV and they were crying. And I was like, fuck, what's happened? Has someone died? And people were tearing down the Berlin Wall. And my dad said, I never thought I would see this. And when I heard the result from Colorado and Washington, that image came into my head, and I thought, this is the first axe into the Berlin Wall of the drug war, and this thing is gonna come down.
Yeah, so awesome. Katie, Judy, do you have any last questions or comments?
No, they were answered. Yeah.
Hooray!
No, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed the book. I thought it was so engaging. Like I said in my review, it was not dry, sort of dull, read at all, but really informative as well. And I would recommend that everyone go and read it. It's really great and genuinely did change my views about a lot of things.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely. Thank you.
Touches your heart.
It's awesome. Yeah, so thank you so much, Johann, for coming and speaking with us. You've given us a lot of hope. And everybody go chasingthescream.com, buy the book. You know you want it. Okay, so thanks a lot, Johann.
Right. Thank you so much. And can I just say as well, before we finish as well, that the work SSDP is doing is so important, and you should be really proud of it.
Thanks.
Oh, thank
We can do that, everyone.
Great. Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.